I want to give you just a brief introduction to Roman myths from the Metamorphoses by Ovid. And there's a beautiful photograph of some Roman ruins to kind of put you in the mood. Ovid was born in 40 BC and lived until 14 AD. And you may recognize that he overlapped, of course, with Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. And he also lived 14 years into the rule of the Pax Romana started by Augustus Caesar. So Ovid was a contemporary of Emperor Augustus, and he was born just after the assassination of Julius Caesar. His well-heeled family made it into the senatorial ranks of the Roman Republic. So, like most artists, it seems, he had sort of a little bit of a leg in both worlds, but he was very much an aristocrat. He was taken by his ambitious father to Rome, and there he built a reputation for himself as a great poet. Unfortunately, at 50, he was exiled, and we'll talk about that a little bit in later slides, but essentially he offended Augustus, and the details remain just a little bit mysterious. The PDF I'm going to assign you to read connected with this unit is a little bit of a mishmash of translations and adaptations of the poem. The book is really quite long. It has over 250 stories, and each book within the book is at least 700 lines of poetry long. And there are tons and tons of translations. I have used different ones, both prose and poetic, over the probably 20 years that I've taught this course. But since this course is already so heavy on reading, I wanted you to read all the really important stories, but I did not want to make this unit particularly burdensome for you. Also, some semesters I used a series of PowerPoints and I tried to revise them, but I felt that they were too much of an abridgment of the stories. After all, these are stories that permeate folklore, popular literature, and film, and any historical survey of literature. We find references to Ovid all over the place in Western culture, Western art, Western music, and Western literature. So while I apologize for the mix of styles, I hope you will find the stories as compelling as readers have not just for centuries, but 2 millennia. And I have interspersed throughout this little beginning video reproductions of art, photographs of art, all of which depict one of Ovid's most well-known stories, that of Apollo's attempted rape of Daphne. In the story, Daphne wants to remain a virgin, but Apollo is a god, and of course one cannot say no to a god. And so in the story, we'll look at her transformation that essentially turns her into something else, but saves her from having to have sexual intercourse that she does not desire. Now, of course, we have 2 great Roman works in this course, and Virgil and Ovid could not be more different. Virgil's Aeneid was a patriotic work, and it transcended being just propaganda by the complexity of its hero. Ovid tells us really violent stories of metamorphoses. These are transformations, mutations, of pursuit and capture, and of pursuit and escape. Most often, characters are transformed from intelligent beings into animals, trees, flowers. And I think sometimes, isn't this what great stresses too often do to us? They rob us of thought and intellectual capacity and logic, and they instill us with emotion. Sometimes they instill us with torpor. We meet great stresses and great violations by withdrawing, by trying to feel nothing. Other times we become instilled with feelings of lust or rage that leads to vengeance, sometimes of greed, sometimes we're transformed into creatures that hunger after what we cannot have. And when godlike, we violate or manipulate others, our actions strip them of their humanity as well as stripping us of ours. We objectify them. So we become those things that in the creation story in the Garden of Eden, the Lord God feared. We become powerful beings, only held in check by knowledge and the dread of death. There are a couple of popular series and films that you can see this at least a couple of them. I'm sure you can think of many more. But for example, Amazon Prime created this series called The Boys, which is about what superheroes might actually be like if they had infinite power, or power that's so much greater than those that they would want to control or take advantage of. And there's also that superhero movie, Superman versus Batman. And of course, Batman fears the prowess of Superman because Batman is a human being and he has a lot of really cool gadgets. But Superman is a demigod. And he's a demigod that we assume will do good, but Batman's sort of afraid that if he ever decides not to, how would we ever keep from becoming victimized by that kind of power? Some scholars and students have also suggested, especially in the hashtag #MeToo period, that maybe we even need trigger warnings for this poem. After all, there's a great deal of violence in Ovid's stories, and there is a particular attention to rapes. Many characters are either raped or barely escape rape. And this has been a problem for Ovid really since the very beginning. Critics have at times considered the poem not worthy of reading and not worthy of stories because they've thought it was immoral as well as impious, because it does depict gods as superheroes who take what they want. And they have found it not edifying in the way, let's say, that the Aeneid, which gives us a hero who is self-sacrificing and patriotic, does. Ovid himself suffered possibly as a result of his writing. He was exiled to an island, and stories about that, as I alluded to earlier, vary over what exactly he did wrong. Did he have a love affair with Augustus's daughter Julia? Ovid claimed he was exiled over a book, The Art of Love, and an error, and he doesn't say what the error was. At any rate, his writing had a much, much different reception than that of Virgil, who viewed Rome as the exemplar of greatness. Beside Virgil's patriotic literary achievement, Ovid seemed at best frivolous and at worst impious, treasonous, and disrespectful. Marguerite Johnson, a British scholar, suggests that the poem that got Ovid into trouble was the Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, a 3-volume lover's handbook that explains the do's and don'ts of personal grooming, how to organize trysts with married women, get her maid on side, repairing a broken heart, surprise your ex while she's in the middle of her beauty routine, yuck, names the best places for hooking up, try the races or the theater, and offers advice on keeping your girl, be attentive when she's unwell. Interestingly, the 3rd volume was written for women, quite a revolutionary move in view of the gender inequality in the twilight years of the 1st century BC. And she goes on to speculate that what irritated Augustus sufficiently enough to relegate the poet to the middle of nowhere was Augustus's perception that the Ars Amatoria had made a mockery of his moral reforms. In other words, even though, of course, adultery went on then just as it has time immemorial, Augustus was trying to tamp down on that kind of behavior, and here was Ovid, who was essentially encouraging it. So, what do we do with a work such as Ovid's? Work which has influenced so much of Western literature and culture? Well, one thing we do know is that the news over the past few years has been filled with the stories of women who, having remained silent for decades after sexual harassment, assault, and rape, have come forward to make their case. So, what do we think when we read Ovid? Does he exploit the experience of rape for salacious entertainment? Or do these tales of metamorphosis explore how the transformations of victims into silence have allowed those with power to exploit them? Is he another victimizer of women, or is he a poet who in some way realizes the sins of the patriarchy for what they are? Johnson goes on to note that while such a situation, which means reading this poem, requires alertness and sensitivity when handling texts such as the Metamorphoses, should the work of Ovid be banned or placed among the shelves marked "Warning, Wicked Books," what would such measures ultimately achieve? Would it augment safe spaces? Or would it censor discussions around rape and shut down interrogations of sex, violence, and female exploitation? Would it silence one of the means of opposition to the societal sickness of rape? Johnson suggests that Ovid himself was certainly no stranger to the impact the powerful can have over the lives of those who have not escaped their notice. Thomas, at the very edges of the Roman Empire, and this is where, of course, Ovid was exiled, was regarded as a barbaric, frightening, and uncivilized place. Ovid certainly painted this way in his poetic epistles, the Tristia, Sorrows, and Epistula ex Ponto, Letters from the Pontus. Forced to exist in a place where his native Latin was scarcely heard, Ovid's despair is evoked in one of his most memorable couplets. Writing a poem you can read to no one is like dancing in the dark. And perhaps beyond just the sheer literary achievement of the poem, 250 stories interlinked in beautifully crafted poetry, Ovid's great poem reminds us that the chaos of creation and destruction, forces over which we have little control, ultimately changes all of us. We each, in our own stories, change from what we were to what we are. Changed, as W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, would write in the 20th century. Changed utterly.